Mr. Secretary General, I'm Bob Burns with Associated Press. Question for you regarding the recent violence in Afghanistan, including, of course, the killings of 2 officers in Kabul on Saturday. This obviously represents a breakdown in trust between ISAF and the Afghans. How long will it take to rebuild that trust, and how can this not affect the timeline for transition?
First of all, I would like to stress it will not in any way affect the timeline of transition. We stick to the timeline we outlined in Lisbon in November 2010. That is, transition will take place until the end of 2014. We have started the transition process. It will continue, and by the end of 2014, we expect the Afghans to take full responsibility for the security all over Afghanistan. So that's my first point. The very tragic events will not in any way affect the timeline. Having said that, let me strongly condemn, of course, the violence we have seen. Nothing at all can justify these killings. How regrettable they are. We should also recall that they do not represent the daily picture of the cooperation between ISAF forces and the Afghan security forces. Let me remind you that 130,000 ISAF troops work on a daily basis together with more than 300,000 Afghan security forces. And the overall picture is a cooperation characterized by trust and confidence. Of course, we monitor the situation closely. We investigate these incidents in a very detailed manner to prevent such tragic incidents from happening in the future. But it would actually be to fulfill the strongest wishes of the enemy if they succeeded in dividing us from our good partners in the Afghan security forces, and that will not happen.
If you may just
briefly, if you say that trust and confidence has not changed, it remains strong, how can that be if there's too little trust to even have personnel present in these offices, in these ministries? Obviously, there is no trust. It just seems to, what you say seems to defy reality.
I do definitely not deny reality. I strongly regret what has happened, and of course we have to take that into account in the way we organize our work in Afghanistan. But what I stressed is that it does not represent the full picture of the daily cooperation between ISAF troops and Afghan security forces. Actually, we have seen the Afghan security forces take lead responsibility for the security in more and more areas of Afghanistan, and they have handled security, also severe security challenges, very professionally. So basically, we do have confidence in the way the Afghan security forces handle the security situation, and we do believe that they will be able to take over full responsibility for the security by the end of 2014. And on a daily basis, we have cooperation with the Afghan security forces characterized by trust and confidence. But obviously, we do take into account what we have seen, and our commanders on the ground take all necessary measures to prevent such incidents from happening again.
Lady over there.
Lucy Ryan from Reuters. Mr. Secretary General, you referenced some of the financial challenges that NATO member nations will face in garnering resources for Afghanistan. I wonder if you can discuss how that might affect future funding for the Afghan National Security Forces. Do you believe that NATO member states will be able to come up with the right level of resources to put the ANSF at a level that Afghanistan really needs? And how big would that ANSF future force be beyond the sort of surge level to 352,000?
Let me start by the latter. We have not yet made a decision on the long-term size of the Afghan security forces. We're in the process of a consultation among allies and partners, and of course also with the Afghan government. We will end up with an assessment of what is a long-term sustainable size of the Afghan security forces. But whatever the exact figure might be, it goes without saying that the size of the Afghan security forces will go well beyond the financial capacity of the Afghan government, which leads to the first part of your question. That is a responsibility for the whole of the international community. It's not only a NATO and ISAF responsibility, but a responsibility for the whole international community to ensure proper financing of the Afghan security forces in the future. And you asked me whether I find it realistic to raise a sufficient amount of funds for that. I think for everybody it's a good deal to finance the Afghan security forces. First and foremost politically, because it's better that the Afghans take full responsibility for the security themselves, that we put a clear Afghan face on the defense of Afghanistan. That's the political aspect. But economically, it's also a good deal because it's less expensive. It's less expensive to finance Afghan security forces than to deploy international troops in Afghanistan. So it's very easy for me to make the case that we should go down that road and let the international community finance the Afghan security forces.
Lady in front.
Viola Ginger from Bloomberg News. Mr. Secretary General, what steps specifically do you think might be necessary in order to return the coalition advisors into the ministries in and around Kabul in order to find the balance between their security and the ability to do the job that you've set out for them? What specific steps do you think that will be necessary? And on the question of the Chicago summit, what do you see coming out of that related to the role of nuclear weapons in NATO going forward? How much will you be able to resolve by the Chicago summit related to that question?
Firstly, on Afghanistan, you asked me about specific steps, and I will leave it to General Allen as commander of ISAF to decide which specific steps should be taken on the ground before our people can return to the ministries and other institutions in Afghanistan. But I can assure you that it is a temporary measure that has been taken, of course, to protect our people, and they will return as soon as possible, because the enemies of Afghanistan will not succeed in dividing us from our partners. We want to resume the close cooperation as soon as possible, but of course we also have to take the necessary measures to ensure that our people can do their work in a secure environment. But I will leave it to COMISAF to make decisions on those specific steps. As far as our nuclear policies are concerned, we will, I expect that we will adopt what we call a defense and deterrence posture review at our summit in Chicago, and that will include nuclear policies. It will be the essence of that document will be to find the appropriate mix between nuclear forces, conventional forces, and missile defense. But it would be premature for me to guess about the final outcome of discussions that have just started recently.
Question at the back.
John David with Al-Hurra. Besides the challenges that NATO is facing in Afghanistan, would you think that the conflict in Syria now could lead to, could affect the regional stability in the Middle East? And how NATO foresee the crisis in Syria?
First of all, I think it's important for me to stress that NATO has no intention whatsoever to intervene in Syria. Obviously, we monitor the situation closely, also because one of our allies is neighboring Syria and may be affected by what is going on in Syria. But again, NATO has no intention to intervene in Syria. But obviously, we strongly condemn what we see in Syria. The crackdowns on demonstrators are outrageous, and the only way forward in Syria is to accommodate the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people and introduce freedom and democracy. Obviously, what is going on in Syria may have an impact on the regional stability.
Question next to
Quick
you.
follow-up. Could you tell us why NATO doesn't want to intervene in Syria? What are the reasons? What are the causes that keeping NATO away from intervening in Syria?
The reason is that allies find that a regional solution to the problems in Syria is the best way forward. Very often I get the question, why could you intervene in Libya but not in Syria? But in Libya we had a very clear United Nations mandate, and we had active support from a number of countries in the region. None of these conditions are fulfilled in Syria.
Gentleman next to you.
Raphael Rains with Radio France International and France 24. What is your assessment on France's return within NATO 3 years after this return has been effective?
I have a very positive assessment of the French reintegration, or full reintegration in our structures, and one of the visible examples of that is standing here right beside me, General Abrial. For the first time ever, a French general has taken command of Allied Command Transformation. General Abrial is in the lead of a very important part of NATO policies, the transformation, the modernization of our alliance, and in very concrete terms, as I mentioned now, in the lead of our project Smart Defense. So that's an example. That's a very concrete example of French reintegration in our structures, that a French general has taken command in one of our major commands. More generally speaking, it goes without saying that when a country is fully integrated in our structures, the weight of the voice of that country will also increase. And that has actually happened. So France plays a very constructive and a very active role within our alliance. And yet another very visible sign of that, I think, was the Libya operation. As you know, it started as a coalition of the willing. But soon it became a NATO operation, and a very successful NATO operation. And I think part of part of the explanation that it became a NATO operation is the fact that France, in the meantime, had been fully integrated in our structures.
Lady in front.
Charlotte Potts with ARD German TV. In regard to the new IAEA report and the Iranian conflict, what role is NATO going to play in that? And also, do you think a military intervention is possible or an option there?
Let me start with the latter. No, I don't think a military intervention is the right way forward. I do hope that the international political and diplomatic efforts will bear fruit and lead to a solution to that very unfortunate problem. Let me also stress that NATO as an alliance is not engaged in the Iran question. Individual allies are, of course, and we support their political and diplomatic efforts to find a solution. We urge the Iranian leadership to comply with their international obligations, including relevant United Nations resolutions. But NATO has no intention whatsoever to intervene.
Lady over there.
Yes, Lamia for Radio Sawa. I have a follow-up question about, you said you had UN Security Council mandate regarding Libya. Do you mean that you're willing to get involved in Syria once you get a mandate? And I have another question about the threat of Al-Qaeda in Africa, northern and sub-Saharan region, specifically after the rise of Islamists in the north and the spread of the Libyan arms all around the country.
Firstly, please remark that I had two elements in my answer on Syria. The one was the one you mentioned, the lack of a United Nations mandate. But the other one is equally important, that Syria is different from Libya. And I do believe that as far as Syria is concerned, the best way forward would be a regional solution. I commend the Arab League for their efforts to find a solution. So far, it's not been successful, but I do believe that countries in the region should engage actively in finding a solution. As far as Syria is concerned, I think that's the right way forward.
What about arming the opposition?
So NATO is not involved in arming anyone except our allies, and definitely we are not, as I told you, NATO has no intention whatsoever to intervene in Syria, and that also includes arming the opposition. Now on Al-Qaeda. I do believe overall that Al-Qaeda has been weakened significantly. Of course, we are aware of cells here and there that operate, but I think from an overall perspective, we have succeeded in weakening Al-Qaeda significantly, and that also goes as far as North Africa is concerned.
Gentleman in front.
Alexander Pakhomov, Press News Agency, Russian News Agency. Do you see any chance for the next meeting of NATO-Russia Council in Chicago without any progress on missile defense? And do you see any progress in the negotiations with Russia on missile defense?
To be honest with you, we have not seen much progress in our negotiations with Russia on missile defense. I'm not going to guess about the probability of having a NATO-Russia summit meeting in Chicago, but it would be my assessment that if we haven't reached a kind of agreement on missile defense, then there won't be a meeting in Chicago. But let me also add to that, that Chicago is obviously not the end of life. I mean, our negotiations with Russia can and will continue also beyond Chicago. But what will happen in Chicago is that NATO will declare an interim capability of the NATO missile defense system, because that decision has been taken in Lisbon at our last summit, that we will build a NATO missile defense system to protect our populations against a real threat. And that's a fact. That will be built. And I hope Russia, in a not too distant future, will realize that it's also in Russia's interest to cooperate with us on a missile defense, because Russia is faced with the same missile threat. And we could make the whole system much more efficient if we cooperate, including exchange data. We could prepare joint threat assessments. We could prepare joint exercises. We could have a Russian system and a NATO system, but they could cooperate. And I think that would be in Russia's interest as well. But as I said, so far we have not seen much progress, and if we don't see more progress before May, then we will not have a meeting, probably.
Lady over there has been waiting very patiently.
Russia recently later on will have an election, a presidential election, so we will hope that the new president from Russia that has more comments or more opinions toward the anti-missile system.
Well, of course, it plays a role. Speaking about the lack of progress in our missile defense negotiations, that Russia has been in an election period for quite some months. First, we had the parliamentary elections in December, and now we have presidential elections in March. During that whole period, it's been my assessment that we wouldn't receive new signals from Russia until after the elections. So obviously, the weeks after the presidential elections in Russia may be decisive as regards possible further progress in missile defense negotiations and the possibility of having a NATO-Russia summit in Chicago.
With that, thank you very much indeed for your questions and for your patience.